Hello everyone, my name is Michelle Diener. I'm here to talk to you about the science of wood. As a furniture designer, when I first started making furniture, one of the first things that I realized I was missing was the actual science behind how a piece of timber came to be. The life behind the tree, the classification of the tree, how is it cut, how is it dried, what is the wood grain saying to me? How does wood move? What are all the causes of these things? Is it environmental? Is it still alive? All these things were still kind of a bit of a mystery to me. So I am here today to talk to you about the importance of knowing it as a furniture designer, as someone who wants to get to know what wood is like, what its properties are like. Today we're going to talk about the classification of trees. We're going to talk about characteristics of the material, the methods of cutting and drying lumber, wood grain, how it actually indicates things such as structure, what type of cut has been made will let you know whether or not it's going to move in the way you want it to. When we get into talking about wood movement, we're going to talk about expansion and contraction, shrinkage, and how the wood grain actually is a bit of an indicator for wood movement. These are all very important things to know when you're deciding on the species that you are going to be using for your piece of furniture, as well as when you're actually doing your design. You need to take some of these things into consideration for strength, durability, where this piece is going to be used, etc. So I have a lot of things to talk to you about today, and I have a few charts to share with you as well. So let's get into it. So when we talk about wood technology, or the science behind wood, there are three main things that come to mind, which are classifications, the parts of the tree, and the characteristics of the wood. We're also going to talk about how you cut the log down into certain types of lumber and how you dry it. So the classification of trees is generally two different classifications. There's softwood and there's hardwood. Softwood, generally speaking, is coniferous. They're the coniferous trees. It doesn't necessarily mean they have soft wood, but they are typically evergreens and don't lose their leaves in the winter. Hardwoods, on the other hand, are speaking mostly of deciduous trees. Broadleaf, all of the eucalyptus here in Tasmania are deciduous trees, and they are actually hard, dense wood. But generally speaking, when we say hardwood and softwood, we're not actually talking about the density of the material. There are several parts to the tree that need to be noted, from as small as the cellular structure of the tree to the growth rings, the early wood, the late wood, sapwood, heartwood, rays, cambium layer. Let me just break a few of them down for you. The cells are the basic structural unit of the wood. They consist of an outer wall and an inner cavity, but when you see the material of wood, it has a basic cell structure. It is a living, breathing thing. Growth rings, we all know what growth rings are. It's proof of an annual year of growth. A growth ring consists of early wood and late wood. When I say early wood, it means it's the light, spongy material that is generated in the spring, and the late wood is the more dense, darker colored material that gets generated in the summer. So 1 year will be a cycle of its life, and those two different types of materials represent one growth ring. There's the sapwood. Now, if we all are familiar with the sapwood and the mature wood, which is the heartwood, we see the sapwood generally has like a lighter color towards the, it's what the material that lies between the bark and the more mature wood. The growth is happening in the sapwood. It's actually happening in the sapwood and the layer next to it, which is the cambium layer. The cambium layer it reacts to a series of hormones that get sent down from the leaves along with the food from the leaves and tells the rest of the tree to grow, essentially. So the cambium layer is kind of like a conduit to allow the food through and allow the next ring to grow. There are, I've mentioned heartwood so far. The sapwood obviously lives on the outside, I just explained that. The heartwood is the more mature wood in the center of the log. As the rings grow, they grow from the youngest part of the tree is going to be the outside, the oldest part of the tree is going to be the inside, which is the heartwood. And the heartwood is no longer a living part of the tree. The cells are not alive, there's no longer sap in that wood. It's the old, mature wood. There are also rays that need to be noted. They're cellular tissue extending from the pith to the bark. So when you see a piece of wood, and we'll talk about this a little later because rays help us identify, rays help us identify grain direction in our logs. You'll see them, they're very specific in certain species of wood. They're like little channels and they run with the direction of the grain. Okay, and so that being said, there are those parts of the tree. Now, when you're looking at a piece of timber, you also notice certain characteristics of the tree. Color, texture, grain, figure, density, and how moist the wood actually is. So let's talk about color. You look at a piece of wood when it's a log when it's first been opened up. The colors are generally quite bright. You can see a lot of moisture because there's a lot of life left in the tree. The color is determined by essentially what chemicals have made their way into the cell walls. When a tree is depending on what kind of soil the tree is in, all the mineral content, all the junk box of all the variety of minerals that exist in that soil make its way up into the tree and have something to say about what color it ends up being. As we explained earlier, the heartwood is usually a darker color, and versus the outer edges, which are lighter colors out to the sapwood. And when you crack open a log and air hits it, there's a chemical process that happens called oxidation, and that, generally speaking, will darken all the colors that you see. They could change them completely, but generally speaking, it's darker. There's texture. The texture of the wood. Is it rough? Is it smooth? The relative size and uniformity of the cell structure is what makes the texture of the wood. If the cells are small and close together, that would make it fine. If they're bigger and spread apart, that would make it rough. Grain generally refers to the growth rings. You know, when we see the grain in the wood, we see all these different shapes and we see some incremental shifts in the rings. It's usually something that appears on the wood's surface, and it's something that we use to identify grain, actually, just because of the contrast. Figure, when you see figure in a tree, it's really also has to do with the grain, but it's a pattern that's usually evident. It's resulting from anatomical structure and irregular coloration or defect. If you see a piece of material that has a lot of curl or a lot of chatoyance, which is this iridescence that can happen with a piece of wood depending on how the light is being reflected off of it, that's when we start to talk about figure. Density, which is essentially weight per unit volume. High density means that it has a harder, stronger wood. Low density, softer. Here's a fact here. The densest known wood is over 33 times heavier than the lightest wood. You can know, you'll feel the difference in your hands of a dense piece of material. The weight is quite strong. And then the last thing I want to mention is moisture content. The weight water in the cells, usually it's expressed as a percentage. A desirable moisture content for most woodworkers, or most usable woodworking wood, is 6 to 10%. Okay, so there's several different ways that we cut the lumber. We have plane sawn, rift sawn, and quarter sawn. Those are the three main ways that we want to focus on, because those are the three different ways you'd find material at the lumber yard that you would use. Plane sawn is tangent to the growth rings, which means that there's an angle less than 45 degrees. It's the most economical way to cut the log down. It's the least amount of waste. It's the least stable. It's stable because it's still something that we're able to sell out on the market, but it's the least stable compared to the other two. Rift sawn basically means that the growth rings are 45 degrees to the surface of the board. And quarter sawn, the growth rings are perpendicular to the wood surface, resulting in straight grain. So quarter sawn, you would see mostly straight grain along the side of the board. Flat sawn, you would see the peaks and the cathedrals and all of the curls and whatnot out of the growth rings on the surface of the board. When we cut the lumber down, we have to dry it, and we have to do that strategically. Moisture is removed from the wood when you're drying it, and so you end up stacking it on stickers, on spacers, to make sure that enough air is always circulating around the material. Now there's two main ways of doing this. You can do it in a kiln, or you can do it out in the open air. Kiln drying is preferred by most woodworkers because it produces a more stable product. It probably also it's a controlled environment, so you get the best results with kiln drying. Air drying is also a fine way to do it. It takes a bit longer. In the kiln, you're forcing warm air around the material. Air drying, sometimes it gets rained on, sometimes the moisture in the air is affecting it. It's still a valid way of drying your lumber, but kiln drying gets the best results. So I mentioned before that one important thing, now that we know a little bit about the technology, the next important thing to pay attention to is the grain in the wood. Now imagine that you are looking at a piece of material and you are trying to figure out how strong it is, the structure of it, and whatnot. Basically, the grain patterns in the wood describe the structure. So I talked about flat sawn and quarter sawn. Flat sawing logs, usually you see those big cathedrals and lines and whatnot. It shows the annual rings more prominently, revealing really nice grain patterns. It's stable, but it tends to twist and cup. So if you were to be able to identify a flat sawn piece of material, you would be able to say, okay, I know, generally speaking, that this twisting and cupping might happen because movement happens through the growth rings. Now with a quarter sawn piece of lumber, you would see more straight grain, and you would see on the end of the board that the grain is running nearly perpendicular to the surface of the wood. It's basically cut along the radius of the log as opposed to the tangent. It's twice as stable as flat sawn and doesn't warp as much, but it does have shrinkage problems. So if you see in the wood that you have nearly straight grain along the face of it and whatnot, you can make the choices accordingly. You would never want to combine the two different types of wood because you would have different shrinkage rates and different types of movement. Now, the grain determines the board's strength. Not only does it tell you how it's going to move, but it tells you the board's strength. This is pretty relevant when you are cutting out certain pieces of, like when you're making parts for a piece of furniture. You would want to orient your grain in the strongest orientation possible. You wouldn't want to ever have short pieces of grain in compromised sections of the wood. The grain tells you, it's pretty evident when you are drawing out curves or you're making long straight pieces, that you would always want to have your lines be parallel with the long grain. Wood will never break. Wood has a hard time, I should say, breaking across the tough cellulose fibers. So the long grain is held together with something called lignin, and the cellulose fibers are, cells of wood that we just spoke about earlier, running along the grain. You'll have 100 times more difficulty breaking across the cellulose fibers than you would along them, breaking the bond of the sticky substance called lignin. Okay. So now, when you're looking at a board, how do you read it? What are you looking for? What is it that you're looking for when you're trying to read the grain? Well, like we spoke about before, rays and vessels and figure kind of tell you a little bit about your board. The rays appear as flecks and little pits in the face of the board. The vessels appear as long open tubes on the face of the board, and the growth rings, as you know, show the figure on the face of the board. So I tend to look at the face and the edge, excuse me. But you also, so you can see if they're running kind of up or along or diagonal across the board. But I also like to run a hand plane across the material and kind of listen to what's happening. You can see if you're going against the grain, you can hear the way the blade is cutting it. But really, it just takes a bit of practice to get a sense of what it is you're looking for. Now, one last little caveat to all of this. Despite the fact that you might have some indicators on how the grain is running and whatnot, there are always going to be a couple species out there or a couple pieces of wood, whatever, that will deceive you. You won't be able to figure out how to read the grain, and you think you have it, and then you send it through the thicknesser, and lo and behold, it's tearing out. So don't worry about that. It'll always be a bit of trial and error. But you do have a few guidelines now to follow that'll help you out. Now, the third thing we are here to talk about that pertains to wood science is understanding wood movement. There will always be wood movement. Wood will always be absorbing and changing and reacting, absorbing moisture and absorbing, reacting to the temperatures. Shrinking and warping can happen seasonally based on a wet season versus a dry season. Temperature fluctuations. A lot of this movement happens before we get the material from the lumberyard. It's already been milled, it's been cut down into wide boards, which has relieved a bit of tension. But inevitably, when you start to use it and start milling it down, you're revealing new surfaces for moisture to be absorbed into. You are relieving more tension that could possibly just be inside the wood on its own. So when you're thinking about wood movement, it's best to start with figuring out what type of wood you're using and what its purpose is and how much it's going to move based on yearly temperatures, where it's going to be finished, what kind of finish you're going to put on it, what kind of gapping you're going to need to leave around drawer faces and whatnot. So first things first, you start with a specific type of wood that you happen to know a bit about. The next thing you need to know is shrinking and expansion happen across the grain, right? So grain changes in the length of a board are negligible. You're always going to experience width changes and thickness changes. So you can always plan for that. And you can, with the help of a few charts and methods, you can calculate how much it's going to move. You figure out general temperatures of where the piece of furniture is going to exist. You can think about yearly averages for where the wood came from or where it's going to be living. How wet is it going to be during a certain time period, and whatnot. And you can find the shrinkage rate. Now I'll pass this chart around that explains to you a little bit about the shrinkage rates for common species. I'll pass these out to the audience here in just a minute, but it's a big factor to take into consideration. Your species, your grain orientation. So like we talked about before, flat sawn and quarter sawn, figure out what kind of grain direction you have, grain orientation I should say, on your piece of material, what kind of species, and so you can help calculate your shrinkage rate. And then you can also determine the moisture content to help you figure out how much it's going to move. There are great moisture meters out there with pins that you can stick deep into the material, and it can get a nice reading for you. That's more accurate than going by a shrinkage chart. It's also, but it is part of the information you need to know to get these percentages anyway, so you can work on both. And there's also another chart that I have that you can look at that talks about the shrinkage rate. So we have this separated into percentages and increments. If your wood is going to shrink at 2%, the change in moisture content would be 0.001 of an inch. So I'll pass this chart around as well. There's a whole formula that you can use to figure this out that we can go into greater detail. And just so you guys know, there's also an online web app that you can just input your species, your moisture content reading, the temperature in which the material is going to be existing at its warmest temperature. And there's an algorithm that exists that's just figured out for you. And you get your results that way. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful for you to hear about the science of wood and some general things about movement and the parts of the trees and grain reading and characteristics of the trees. I find that it's the most important to get a sense of all of this before you're actually heading into your design. Once you start calculating all of this and you see what's happening and you can kind of get a sense of colors and textures and figures, all of that's really important information that will then lead you into the next step of your design. And the design work is the most fun part of it. Thank you very much. I will talk to you again soon.